Church. I'm honored to be speaking to my professor and also on this very important topic, that is on legacy of Achebe, particularly to commemorate Heritage Day. As a non-South African, when I came in contact with the idea of the Heritage Day, I went to read the origin of the Heritage Day, and I understand that it was initially the Zulu people who practiced this to commemorate Shaka that was able to bring them under one umbrella. But as South Africa has gone beyond just the Zulu, South Africa is multiracial, and to be able to carry the umbrella of the nation South Africa, the Heritage Day was promulgated as a law to capture all the cultures that make up the Rainbow Nation. So I find it very useful and very touching that Father Jackson was interested in talking about Achebe far away from Nigeria, coincidentally where I come from. But because Professor is a professor, I'm just trying to learn literature. Definitely, as a South African, I feel he should be more equipped to talk about Achebe from a critical point of view and maybe objective point of view much more than the Nigerian. And that is how we have invited her, and we're glad to have her around. As you can see, she is loaded with the books. And we're going to start straight from one of the most renowned books written by Achebe called Things Fall Apart. From what I gathered, this book has been translated into 50 international languages. Yeah, with the German copy titled Okonko, that is the central character in the novel.
If I may interrupt briefly, there is an Afrikaans translation I have discovered.
Fine.
It's called Een Pad Loop Dood, which is a beautiful translation of the title.
Oh, that's wonderful. So it challenges you to go and read Things Fall Apart in Afrikaans after this talk. Talking about legacy, what can we say, for instance, is the legacy of Things Fall Apart, a novel published in 1958 with regards to Africa and the world?
This text was not the first novel by an African in English, or the first novel by an African to be published internationally. For instance, some of our South African writers preceded this text and an African text being published in English and being noticed internationally. But it created by far the greatest stir of any African novel yet, and it has never lost its preeminent position. Quite recently, they're always making these lists of the 100 best books and so on. The only African novel, which I think was an injustice to other magnificent novels from our continent, but the one African novel they could not omit and included on the list was Things Fall Apart. It's been more than 10 million copies has been sold of this text all over the world. Now, thinking about what legacy it brought for Africa and for the world, Achebe himself said that he set out to write this particular text because history of Africa, including Nigeria, had up to that point not been written by Nigerians or Africans. The history was written by the colonizers. So from the British point of view, history was described in a particular way. He decided that Africa needed to tell its own story. And it was not only a matter of putting Africa's own story in its own voice out there in contrast with history writing, it was also the writing of novels and literature. And Chinua Achebe took aim, so to speak, at a very well-known novel in English, a great classic in English, Joseph Conrad's book called Heart of Darkness. What he took issue with was not that Conrad is pro-colonial. In fact, it is an anti-colonial novel, and Achebe recognizes that. But Achebe objected to the way in which Conrad portrayed Africans, and in fact Africans from more or less his own part of the continent in that text. And so he set out to write Things Fall Apart as a kind of corrective to tell Africa's story from its own perspective. So it tells the story of a community in the Igbo land area, which is in the east of Nigeria. Nigeria somehow is never thought of as having a south. It has a west, which is broadly Yoruba land, an east, which is broadly Igbo land, and a north, which is Hausa, Fulani, mainly Muslim territory. And there are, in fact, many more peoples and languages in Nigeria. You know, some people say over 200, some people say over 400 language groups. But in any case, these are the main language and culture groups, the dominant ones. So Achebe told the story from the perspective of people in his own area. First of all, how they lived before they came into contact with Europeans, with the British colonizers who moved into Nigeria very gradually in the 19th century. And then in the later part of the novel, we begin to see how the effect of this of the colonizers' presence and of their misunderstanding, their misreading of the local culture, their dominance has in fact a very detrimental effect on the local culture. And that is why the novel is given this rather despairing seeming title, Things Fall Apart, because it depicts the way in which the local culture seemed to be crumbling, seemed to be giving way, seemed to be losing its authority. And what happens is not only the influence of colonizers, but the influence also of missionaries. So it brings a new administration. Suddenly, local people are not governed by their own leaders. They are governed by colonial administrators who are British. And there has been the introduction of a new religion. Now, Chinua Achebe was in part telling his own family history, because although his own father was a Christian catechist, and therefore somebody who himself became a sort of Christian missionary among his own people, his father had been brought up after the death of his parents by a great uncle who was a very firm adherent of the local traditional religion and culture and practices. And he had been very tolerant and received the first Christian missionaries, allowing them to stay in his own compound. But after a while, he asked them to leave. And his reason was their songs were too sad. I think he didn't hear the hymn that we sang this morning. It was anything but sad. In any case, so that was how this novel came about. It depicts, therefore, the way in which Africa, or this particular area of Africa, has its own complex, balanced, interesting culture, religion, systems of law, systems of local governance. Everything is well run. At the same time, Achebe concedes that there are certain practices that are cruel. For instance, twins were believed to bring evil. And so if a mother gave birth to twin babies, they were taken away and left to die. And there was also a particular caste, the Osu, and they were a slave caste, and they were not allowed to intermarry, you know, in other words, like a form of apartheid. They were not allowed to intermarry with Igbo people of, you know, the sort of main grouping. So it's a very balanced account in its representation of the colonizers and the missionaries. It's also very balanced. It shows the good and it shows the bad. And Achebe is not, he's no kind of fervent. He recognizes the good that was brought by European civilization, but he is very, very wary also of the way in which it was imposed and of the fact that the colonizers who came in did not show due respect for the local cultures. And so this novel sets out to correct that, and it ends very sadly with the death of the main character. But he's a flawed man. In that sense also it's a very balanced and fascinating novel. So that's, I think, in a nutshell, one could say. I could go on for ages.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. Yeah, I was reading and I came across several writers on the continent attributing their influences to be able to write, having read Things Fall Apart. One of them is a South African writer, Soriti. Yes, Soriti, and so many other Nigerian writers, and indeed Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a Kenyan writer. What elements of Achebe's Things Fall Apart do you think these writers have tried to demonstrate in their work, and they claim that this is the influence they got from him?
Well, I think one thing that I would begin by saying would be that Achebe's legacy is not only from this novel, which is why I brought along all the novels. It's not a large, it's not a huge output, 5 novels. And as you can see, most of them quite thin texts. And yet they've been enormously influential. One thing that I do point out when I speak to people about Achebe is that he was not only a novelist of rural and pre-colonial, call it tribal Africa. In his very second novel, he already depicts urban Africa. I'm sorry, this novel was chewed, as you can see, by a dog at home. So the cover is half torn. It's called No Longer at Ease. And that's a novel set in the great teeming city of Lagos. It's one of the busiest cities on this continent, with enormous traffic problems, but it's a hugely vibrant cultural and economic center on the African continent, and set on the coast in the Yoruba land in the east. And so you can see Achebe, in the first place, moving out of the Igbo land region, and secondly, moving from the rural, the village and tribal world into the urban sphere, where young Africans are beginning to work in the civil service, as the main character in this text does. But you were asking me, I must come back to your question, about Achebe's influence on other writers through his writings. His influence on writers such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Well, Ngugi and Achebe are sometimes put kind of almost at variance with each other. I think that Ngugi was very grateful to Achebe, first of all, for presenting him with a model of African writing, of African novel writing. Because many of the early African writers, and in South Africa also, they said they thought Africans could not write novels because there were no examples initially. And so this is the great thing that someone like Achebe rectified. He demonstrated how brilliantly an African could write, could construct a complex novel or many novels, and present it in English and have it read and recognized and praised as a magnificent achievement, a work of great literary art all over the world. So in that sense, he inspired many readers, such as Ngugi. He also became the editor of the Heinemann African Writers series. You know, these texts were all published in that series. And as an editor, it was he who received Ngugi's first script, novel script, and immediately recognized that it was a novel worth publishing. It was a novel called Weep Not, Child. Okay. But later in his writing career, Ngugi began to criticize. He didn't name Achebe, he was always very respectful. But what he did begin to say was that African writers were betraying their own cultures by not writing in their own languages, and so he started trying to rectify that. At the same time, of course, his texts do immediately get translated into English. And Achebe's position on this is that that English has been given to me. You know, that it's the national language of Nigeria, because Nigeria has so many local languages, so it couldn't adopt any one of even the three main languages, because the others would be so angry. So English, despite the fact that it was brought by colonizers, has been Africanized. And my position as a professor of African literature in an English department is that English has become an African language, because Africans use it and need it to speak to one another as well as to the world.
Thank you. Professor shows to have lived in Nigeria, but she has never lived there. She understands the intricacies of the country. Now, I was reading an article yesterday, and I got this statement made by Nelson Mandela, the former president of South Africa. He describes Achebe as a writer in whose company the prison walls will fall down. What is your take about this?
That quotation is very famous, because a tribute from Nelson Mandela is something that any writer would treasure greatly. As a matter of interest, I've just been reading Achebe's last book, which was published not long before he died. It's called There Was a Country. This text is not a novel. It is in fact a very carefully researched account of what is sometimes known as the Biafran War, and sometimes known as the Nigerian Civil War. I think that's considered the more politically correct reference nowadays. Why? Because it was a very, very controversial war, and the way it went and the way it was conducted was very controversial. Achebe's own position on it is probably controversial, but he did not change his position. This text, which he wrote and published in old age, does not move at all from the position he adopted at the time when the war started. And according to his own account, well, I'm digressing, I'll come back to Nelson Mandela. According to Achebe himself, it happened because the British, when they left Nigeria, gave more power to the north, and they were actually the east and the west were actually more populous, so there were always ethnic tensions. These escalated, and there was jealousy. At any rate, I can't go into the complex causes, but what began to happen was persecution of Igbo people in the other regions, particularly in the north. In fact, someone like Achebe refers to it as genocide, that was beginning to happen. So they fled back to the eastern part, to Igbo land, and then they decided to secede, to make their section of the country independent, and they called it Biafra. And then there was a huge civil war, because most of the oil was in that area, and the international community also didn't want Nigeria to break apart, particularly the British. They supported the Nigerian federal forces, and so on. It was a terrible war. And then they cut off food aid, because people began to die of hunger. And in the end, the estimate Achebe gives about 3 million people died. And this was long before the genocide in Rwanda, long before Darfur, and the international community behaved very badly. So Achebe felt compelled to write this text, and it's not an easy book to read. It doesn't have the sparkle of his novels. There's very little humor in it. It's grim. It's a terrible story, and it's a book for, that makes, I think, many accusations, corruption, injustice, cruelties that were perpetrated by many people, and Achebe names people. I think many people are going to be very angry about this book. But he ends the book, and this is where I come back to Nelson Mandela, by writing the final section of 2 pages and dedicating it about Nelson Mandela and dedicating the text to him as setting the greatest example of what an African leader should be like. Particularly in the graciousness of his leadership and in the fact that he vacated leadership after only 1 term. I did not try and cling to power. So, in that sense, I think Achebe and Nelson Mandela are figures of some kind, that have some kind of affinity.
Great. The professor is saying it. What I get in the course of this discussion is the fact that Nigeria is multi-ethnic,
Yes.
and also South Africa is multi-ethnic and multiracial. Now, with the war in Nigeria and effect, what lessons can we say are useful for South Africa in the case of Nigeria, so as to either avert any form of people wanting to feel that they are homogeneous, because there aren't any nations today that are homogeneous? What can you say is a lesson that South Africans can learn as we celebrate Heritage Day?
On the one hand, I'm always a little bit wary of saying, you know, what one country achieved should be done somewhere else, because, you know, it's never completely comparable. Okay. And I think also that what led to the Nigerian Civil War were very particular causes. And one problem, as Achebe sees it, that led to the outbreak, or that led to the attempted secession, well, in fact, it did last for 3 years, the secession of the Biafran, the eastern region, and the Civil War, that the country was badly run, as he sees it. So he makes a very strong statement, which I actually marked here to read out, because I think this is definitely one lesson, which sounds almost as though it is spoken for this day, for this occasion. Here Achebe says, why do African leaders choose bad models like Malawian President Kamuzu Banda, who was a tyrant, and instead of good ones like Mandela? What makes me wonder whether any of these life presidents consider how Mandela became the beacon of justice and hope on the continent, indeed for the world. For those who do not know, Mandela did not have an easy life. He fought alongside African heroes such as Biko Sisulu Tambo and other brave activists for the liberation of his people from one of the most racist systems the world has ever known. For his efforts, he was sent to prison. So, like South Africa, there is a liberation background, but unlike South Africa, hopefully, certainly to date, the heritage of the liberation was not properly implemented. And instead of seeing to justice being prevalent across the country, instead of allowing the oil wealth which Nigeria began to get in millions and millions of naira, this was siphoned off by a corrupt and very wealthy governing class. And I think there is a very strict warning against, perhaps not nearly in the same to the same extent, but we do know that things of that kind are beginning to rear their head in our society. And Achebe, over and over in this text, insists with anger and indignation, with great moral indignation, that the wealth of a country must be shared that Achebe is not a primordialist. He doesn't want Africans to go back to the time before computers and cars, etc. He wants Africa to modernize, but he wants Africans not to allow the gap between leadership and people to develop and to become as pathological as he did in Nigeria.
Yes, that is very well captured. The question was asked because the fact I understand what, apart from the fact of bad governance in Nigeria, what led to the civil war was the question of difference. People feeling I do not belong to the other side, therefore the other side does not belong to me. Unless people understand that humanity is humanity, then there will be problem. People will never seek to break beyond the confines where they find themselves. I would cite an example. The first time I had the opportunity of going to England, I went to a particular part of England, and on a bus, I discovered that the number of people on the bus that were Africans were more than the Europeans. So I asked myself, is this England? Or, because if you take a photograph there and you tell someone it's England, he's likely to argue. It is not. There were more black people on the bus than were British people on the bus. Then I asked someone, are you comfortable with this? They said, oh, we are used to it. And I learned a lesson from it, that this idea of others versus us is a very big problem. And until people move away from this, then we are not going to be able to live peacefully. We are not going to be able to make any serious progress as society. And that which has been fought by freedom fighters given to us, it's going to be destroyed overnight. So I do believe that the legacy of writers, like the legacies of freedom fighters, is something that must be cherished by all and must be sustained if Africa is to wake up in the next dispensation to find itself among the nations that are called progress, that are progressive. I have another question that I want you to talk about. Some writers have called Achebe a prophet, and he is the kind of writer that has chronicled not just Nigeria's journey as a nation, but Africa's African society with the kind of political trajectory that this continent has witnessed. In fact, some people call him the eagle on an Iroko tree. What would you say in regards to his works, beginning from Things Fall Apart to the last one?
What is the last part of the question?
That
Where?
is, what would you say?
What are the prophetic elements?
Yeah, the prophetic elements
Okay.
in this work, beginning from the first to the last.
Okay. The most obvious example that is usually given is Achebe's novel called A Man of the People. It was his fourth novel. Okay. He wrote this novel to illustrate corrupt leadership, but also how easy it is to be seduced by, if a corrupt leader takes a shine to you and invites you to live with him and stay in his palatial home, then suddenly, as happens to the young, idealistic young and politically quite radical young teacher, who is the main character, suddenly he becomes a lot less critical. Suddenly this leader doesn't seem so terrible. But then this leader steals his girlfriend. And so he learns a lesson. And so he goes back to his original position and he becomes in fact a political opponent. And he gets into great trouble because he stands as a young upstart with a new political vision against this older man who is a chief and very popular with the rural people, but hugely corrupt, you know. He owns fleets of buses, blocks come his way and so on. And by the end of the novel, things have become so bad that the elections are rigged also, very blatantly. And Achebe always tells things with a touch of humor. For instance, he refers to the joke that Nigerians make about the fact that women go into the voting booths with their bras stuffed full of voting papers, and they call it breastfeeding the ballot. But at any rate, Achebe wrote this novel, and at the end of the novel he wrote that a coup happens. The military step in and take over because the civilian leadership is so blatantly corrupt that things just cannot go on. It's too obvious. There's thuggery. You know, people get beaten up to vote for the right party and so on. You know, we all know the sort of story that happens. Now, Achebe wrote this novel, and it had just been published. He had, I think, something like the first copy with him, and there was a writers' gathering in Lagos. And then somebody said, Achebe, or Chinua, you are a prophet. You know, that very night, there was the first military coup in Nigeria. And Achebe himself even fell under suspicion. People said, yeah, you probably knew something. But you know, he's adamant that he didn't write it as a prediction. He wrote it in terms of what he was portraying in this text. But it does, I think, indicate, it's one very clear example of how prophetic his vision is and remains. I think for us nowadays, the text most relevant is probably Anthills of the Savannah, which shows a modern African government in an unnamed country. It resembles Nigeria, but it could be applied to many others, and how it falls, and how those who try and stand against it learn many lessons of things they should have done better and more efficiently.
Yeah, in a nutshell, as we try to bring this discussion to a close, I'll quote Achebe and ask you to make an input. In 2006, he was quoted in the Atlantic newspaper saying that his greatest desire was to inspire voiceless people to share their own histories and create a balance of stories. In the context of today, what can you say to the congregation and the audience about writing a story, however small you think the story is, and the importance such can make in the life of a nation like South Africa and the world?
I think that's a beautiful expression, a balance of stories. And I think in our country, you know, publishing is beginning to spread out. There are literary prizes for publications in all our local languages. If you don't want to write in English, write in your own language, whatever it may be. But get your story out there. And even if you don't get it published, write your story for your children and your grandchildren. You know, in my family, we have stories written by a grandparent, you know, a grandfather and a grandmother on different sides. And those stories are tremendously enriching to family life. So I think that's a way to contribute to heritage, to realize that although heritage is something we inherit, heritage is also something to which we need to contribute. And we mustn't think that our stories are insignificant. They're going to matter to somebody somewhere, and they're going to hold lessons.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.